I'm Maggie and I'm 30 years old. I just discovered my family spent $40,000 of my money on a European vacation, while I've been working 16-hour shifts as a nurse to keep them afloat. My mother's voice echoed through the phone from their five-star hotel in Paris. Stop being dramatic. Maggie, we deserve to have some fun too. I hung up and immediately canceled every single credit card they had access to. Their reaction was going to be epic. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like your family's personal ATM. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this mess. 3 years ago, my dad lost his job at the auto plant after 22 years. Mom had never worked a day in her life, and my younger brother Danny was still in college. Someone had to step up. And naturally, that someone was me. I'd just finished nursing school and landed my first real job at Mercy General Hospital. Instead of celebrating my new career, I found myself supporting 4 adults on my entry-level salary. That's when I made the mistake of letting them use my credit cards for emergencies, Dad's prescriptions, Mom's grocery runs, Danny's textbooks. What started as temporary help became permanent expectation. Before I knew it, I was working double shifts just to make minimum payments while they lived like nothing had changed. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I'd just finished a brutal night shift in the ICU, dealing with 3 cardiac emergencies and a trauma case. My feet ached, my back screamed, and I hadn't eaten anything but vending machine crackers in 12 hours. All I wanted was to collapse in my tiny studio apartment and sleep until my next shift started. But when I checked my phone, there were 17 missed calls from my mother and a string of text messages that made my blood boil. Emergency at the house! Need money for repairs! The messages escalated from concerned to frantic to outright manipulative. Your father's having chest pains from the stress. How can you ignore us like this? I drove straight to their house, my nursing training kicking in. If Dad was having chest pains, I needed to assess him immediately. I burst through the front door, medical bag in hand, ready to call an ambulance if necessary. Instead, I found the house completely empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of the furniture I'd helped them pay for over the past 3 years. My dad's recliner was gone. Mom's china cabinet had vanished. Even Danny's gaming setup had disappeared. For a moment, I thought we'd been robbed. Then I saw the note on the kitchen counter, written in my mother's flowery handwriting. Gone to Europe for 3 weeks. Don't worry about us. We're finally taking that dream vacation we always talked about. Love you! I stood there holding that note, and something inside me just snapped. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. Crystal clear, undeniable clarity about what my family really thought of me. I wasn't their daughter or their sister. I was their personal piggy bank with legs. But they'd forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one with access to the credit card accounts. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and online banking. I logged into every account, checked every statement, and slowly pieced together the scope of their deception. The numbers made me physically sick. $43,000 in charges over the past 6 weeks. First-class flights to London, 5-star hotels in Paris, guided tours through Italy, shopping sprees in Milan. They'd planned this for months while I was killing myself at 2 different hospitals. While I was picking up extra shifts in the emergency room at St. Mary's, they were researching luxury spa treatments in Switzerland. While I was eating ramen noodles for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries after paying their bills, they were booking wine tours in Tuscany. The most insulting part? They'd used my good credit, built through years of responsible financial management, to fund a lifestyle I'd never experienced myself. I'd never even been on an airplane, let alone stayed in a hotel that cost more per night than I made in a week. My phone rang. Mom calling from overseas. I let it go to voicemail. She called again immediately. And again. On the 4th call, I answered. Maggie, honey, we're having trouble with the credit cards. Her voice was cheerful, completely oblivious to what was coming. The hotel says there's some kind of issue with payment. Can you call the bank and straighten it out? I took a deep breath, drawing on every ounce of professionalism I'd learned dealing with difficult patients. The cards are canceled, Mom. What? Her tone sharpened. What do you mean canceled? I mean, I called every credit card company and closed every account you had access to. Effective immediately. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then came the explosion I'd been expecting. How dare you? She screeched. We're stranded here. Do you know how embarrassing this is? The hotel staff is looking at us like we're common criminals. How do you think I felt when I discovered you'd stolen $40,000 from me? I kept my voice level, but my hands were shaking. We didn't steal anything. You gave us permission to use those cards? For emergencies. Dad's medications, Danny's school expenses. Not for a luxury vacation I can't even afford myself. Don't be so dramatic, Maggie. We work hard too. We deserve to have some fun. That phrase, we work hard too, might have been the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. Mom hadn't held a job since before I was born. Dad had been unemployed for 3 years. Danny's only job was being a professional student on my dime. What work exactly are you referring to, Mom? Because I'm pretty sure spending my money doesn't qualify as hard labor. The conversation deteriorated from there. Mom alternated between guilt trips, outright lies, and threats. Dad got on the line and tried his wounded veteran routine, even though he'd never served in the military. Danny texted me from Rome, claiming this was all a misunderstanding and couldn't I just fix it like I always did. But something fundamental had shifted in me. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't scrambling to solve their problems. I wasn't calculating how many extra shifts I'd need to work. I wasn't mentally rearranging my budget to accommodate their latest crisis. Instead, I was doing something I'd never done before. I was saying no. Figure it out yourselves, I told them before hanging up. Then I turned off my phone and went to sleep for 12 straight hours. When I woke up, I had 47 missed calls and 83 text messages. Most were from my family, but a few were from relatives I barely knew, all telling me what a horrible daughter I was for abandoning my family in their time of need. Apparently, Mom had launched a full-scale propaganda campaign, painting herself as the victim of my heartless cruelty. The messages followed a predictable pattern. First came the guilt. How could you do this to your own mother? Then the manipulation. Your father's blood pressure medication is running low. What if something happens to him? Finally, the threats. Don't expect us to forgive you for this. You've shown your true colors. But here's what they didn't understand. I was done caring about their forgiveness. For 3 years, I'd been so desperate for their approval that I'd sacrificed my health, my finances, and my future. I'd worked myself into exhaustion trying to prove I was worthy of their love, only to discover they saw me as nothing more than a renewable resource. Have you ever experienced the moment when you realize your family loves what you can provide more than who you actually are? The relief and heartbreak happening simultaneously is something else entirely. I made myself coffee, real coffee from actual beans instead of the instant stuff I'd been drinking to save money, and sat down to plan my new life. First, I calculated exactly how much money their European adventure had cost me. Then I figured out how long it would take to pay off the debt if I stopped supporting them entirely. The answer surprised me. 8 months. Just 8 months of keeping my own money, and I'd be free of their financial chains forever. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went grocery shopping without checking my bank balance first. I bought fresh vegetables, good cheese, wine that didn't come from a box. I even splurged on the expensive shampoo I'd been wanting to try. It felt like rebellion. When my phone rang that evening, showing Mom's international number, I didn't hesitate. I answered on the first ring. "How are you enjoying your vacation?" I asked pleasantly. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Maggie, we need to talk about this situation." "What situation?" "You're on your dream vacation. I'm finally getting some sleep. Everybody wins." "This isn't funny. We're stuck here with no way to pay for anything." I took a sip of my wine and smiled. That does sound like quite the predicament. Over the next few days, my family's European vacation became significantly less luxurious. Without access to my credit cards, they couldn't extend their stay at the 5-star hotels. They couldn't book the spa treatments or the guided tours. Most importantly, they couldn't continue shopping like they were millionaires. The phone calls became increasingly desperate. Dad tried to convince me that this whole thing was Mom's idea and he'd been against it from the beginning. Danny called crying, claiming he'd had no idea about the expense and just wanted to come home. Mom oscillated between fury and manipulation, sometimes within the same conversation. But the most revealing call came from my Aunt Patricia, Dad's sister, who'd apparently been recruited to talk sense into me. "Maggie, honey," she began in that patronizing tone relatives use when they're about to ask for something. "Your parents are really struggling over there. They made a mistake, yes, but don't you think you're being a little harsh?" "Aunt Pat," I said, settling back in my chair with another cup of that good coffee. "Let me ask you something. When was the last time you gave my parents $40,000? Well, that's not the point. Actually, that's exactly the point. If you think I'm being too harsh, you're welcome to wire them money yourself. I can give you the bank information for their hotel." The silence on the other end was deafening. Funny how people who had opinions about my money were suddenly quiet when asked to contribute their own. "I don't have that kind of money just lying around," she finally admitted. "Neither did I. That's why I'll be paying it off for the next 8 months. Meanwhile, my life was getting better by the day. Without the constant stress of covering their expenses, I was sleeping better. I'd cut back to 40 hours a week at Mercy General and dropped the weekend shifts at St. Mary's entirely. For the first time in years, I had actual weekends. I started doing things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. I went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning and bought flowers for my apartment. I met my friend Sarah for brunch, something I'd been putting off for months because I couldn't afford restaurant prices. I even signed up for a yoga class, using money that would have otherwise gone to Mom's credit card payment. The revelation that hit me during my third yoga session was profound. I'd been living like a broke college student while supporting a family's upper-middle-class lifestyle. They were eating steak while I survived on pasta. They were buying name-brand everything while I shopped at discount stores. They were planning vacations while I was calculating whether I could afford new scrubs. But the real wake-up call came when I ran into my old nursing school friend Jennifer at the grocery store. She'd graduated the same year as me and worked at a different hospital across town. "Maggie, you look amazing," she said. And I realized it was true. The dark circles under my eyes were fading. I'd gained back some of the weight I'd lost from stress and irregular eating. "How's everything going?" "Actually, really well," I said, and meant it for the first time in years. "That's great. Hey, are you still interested in that travel nursing position I mentioned? The agency I work with is looking for ICU nurses for a 3-month assignment in Hawaii. The pay is incredible." Hawaii. A place I'd dreamed of visiting since I was a kid but never imagined I could afford. "Tell me more." As Jennifer explained the opportunity, I realized something that would have been impossible just a week earlier. For the first time in 3 years, I was free to consider what I wanted to do with my life. The travel nursing position in Hawaii was everything Jennifer had promised and more. The pay was nearly double my current salary. Housing was provided, and I'd be working with some of the best medical professionals in the Pacific. But the best part? I could actually afford to take it. I submitted my application that night and got a call back the next morning. The interview went so well they offered me the position on the spot, with a start date 6 weeks away. I accepted immediately. Of course, my family chose that moment to return from their abbreviated European adventure. I got the call from Mom while I was at work, finishing up what would be one of my last regular shifts at Mercy General. Her voice was different somehow, smaller and less commanding than usual. "We're at the airport," she said without preamble. "Our flight lands at 6 tonight." "Okay," I said, making notes in a patient chart. "Safe travels. Are you going to pick us up?" The question caught me off guard. For 3 years, I'd automatically dropped everything whenever they needed transportation, usually because their car was broken down or they couldn't afford gas. But now? "How were you planning to get home from the airport when you booked your return flights?" I asked. "Well, we assumed you'd be there." "You assumed wrong. I'm working until 7, and then I have plans." The plans involved ordering pizza and watching Netflix, but she didn't need to know that. "Maggie, please. We don't have money for a taxi after everything that's happened." "That sounds like poor planning on your part." I hung up and immediately felt lighter. 3 years of automatic yes responses, and I'd finally discovered the power of no. They showed up at my apartment at 9 that night, having somehow managed to get home without my help. Mom looked tired and angry. Dad seemed uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. Danny appeared genuinely remorseful, which was progress. "We need to talk," Mom announced, settling onto my couch without invitation. "Actually, I need to talk," I corrected, remaining standing. "I'm taking a travel nursing position in Hawaii. I'll be gone for 3 months, starting in 6 weeks." The announcement hit them like a physical blow. Mom's mouth fell open. Dad finally looked up from studying his shoes. Danny's eyes widened in what might have been admiration. "You can't just leave," Mom sputtered. "What about our expenses? What about the house payments? What about them? How are we supposed to manage without your income?" I'd been wondering when someone would finally acknowledge that I'd been supporting the entire family. It only took a $40,000 wake-up call. "The same way you managed before I graduated nursing school," I said calmly. "You'll figure it out." Dad cleared his throat. "Maggie, I know we made some mistakes with this trip." "Some mistakes?" I laughed, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Dad, you spent more money in 3 weeks than I make in a year. That's not a mistake. That's a deliberate choice." "We didn't think you'd mind," Danny said quietly. "You didn't think at all. If you had thought, you might have considered that I've been working myself into exhaustion to keep this family afloat while you all lived like I was some kind of inexhaustible resource." The conversation that followed was one of the most honest we'd ever had, which isn't saying much considering our family's relationship with truth. They made excuses, I provided facts, they offered apologies, I explained consequences. They promised to change. I told them it was too late for promises. By the end of the night, several things were clear. I was going to Hawaii with or without their approval. I would no longer be contributing to their living expenses. And most importantly, our relationship would never again be based on my financial usefulness to them. As they prepared to leave, Mom played her final card. If you do this, don't expect to be welcomed back into this family. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had raised me but never really seen me. Mom, I said softly, I haven't been welcomed in this family for years. I've just been useful. The next 6 weeks were a revelation. Without the burden of supporting 3 other adults, I had money left over after paying my bills. Not just a few dollars, but actual significant money. I opened a savings account for the first time since nursing school and watched the balance grow instead of disappear. I also had something I'd almost forgotten about: free time. Evenings when I wasn't picking up extra shifts, weekends when I wasn't running errands for my family or dealing with their latest crisis. Time to remember who I was when I wasn't being someone's solution. My family's reaction to my upcoming departure evolved from anger to bargaining to what I can only describe as panic. Dad actually looked for jobs, something he hadn't done seriously in 3 years. Mom talked about going back to school for her GED. Danny started looking into student loans to cover his remaining semester. The effort was impressive, but it felt like too little, too late. These were things they should have been doing all along instead of relying on their daughter's guilt and sense of obligation. 3 weeks before my departure, Danny showed up at my apartment alone. He looked genuinely apologetic in a way that reminded me of the little brother I'd once protected from playground bullies. I didn't know how bad it was, he said, sitting awkwardly on my couch. The money stuff, I mean. I knew you were helping, but I didn't realize you were paying for everything. What did you think was happening? Danny? Where did you think the mortgage payments were coming from? He shrugged, looking younger than his 21 years. I guess I didn't think about it at all. Mom and Dad always made it seem like everything was fine. Everything was fine for you. It wasn't fine for me. He nodded, staring at his hands. I got a job at the campus bookstore. It's not much, but it's something. And I'm going to take out loans for my last semester so you don't have to pay for it anymore. It was the first time any member of my family had taken actual responsibility for their impact on my life. The gesture meant more than he probably realized. That's good, Danny. I'm proud of you for stepping up. Are you really never coming back? The question hung in the air between us. I'd been asking myself the same thing for weeks. I honestly don't know, I said finally. But I know I can't go back to the way things were. I won't be anyone's personal ATM ever again. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected visitor at work. One of the other nurses told me someone was asking for me in the lobby, and I found my father sitting in the waiting area, looking older than I remembered. Dad, what are you doing here? I wanted to talk to you before you leave, and I figured you'd hang up if I called. He wasn't wrong. I'd been screening their calls for days. I got a job, he said without preamble. Night security at the industrial park. It's not much, but it's honest work, and it doesn't aggravate my back too much. I waited for the catch, the reason this was somehow my problem to solve. I also wanted to apologize, he continued, and that caught me off guard. Not for the trip, though that was wrong too. For letting you carry all of us for so long. I told myself I was just temporarily down on my luck, that I'd get back on my feet soon. But the truth is, it was easier to let you handle everything than to face my own failures. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, he said. I'm not asking you to come back and support us again. I'm just asking you to maybe someday consider giving your old man another chance to be the father you deserved all along. For the first time in months, I felt something other than anger toward my family. Not forgiveness exactly, but hope. Maybe they were capable of change after all. My last day at Mercy General was bittersweet. The colleagues who'd become like family threw me a small goodbye party, complete with a cake shaped like a palm tree and gift cards for Hawaiian restaurants. Sarah presented me with a brand new set of scrubs in tropical prints, saying I needed to look the part. You know what I'm most proud of? She asked as we cleaned up after the party. What? You finally put yourself first. I've watched you sacrifice everything for people who took you for granted for years. This feels like you're finally waking up. She was right. I was waking up from a 3-year nightmare of martyrdom and financial abuse. But I was also scared. What if I was making a terrible mistake? What if my family really did need me? Those doubts evaporated the next morning when Mom called with her latest crisis. The washing machine is broken, she announced without greeting. We need money to fix it. Did you call a repair service? I asked. They want $200 just to come look at it. That's highway robbery. So take your clothes to the laundromat until you can afford the repair. The laundromat? Maggie, be serious. We can't haul our dirty clothes around town like common people. The phrase common people crystallized everything wrong with my family's worldview. They'd been living above their means for so long, funded by my sacrifice, that they'd forgotten what normal financial limitations looked like. Mom, most people use laundromats when their washing machines break. It's not a social tragedy. It's a temporary inconvenience. Well, I suppose if you're determined to abandon your family, we'll have to figure out how to live like poor people. The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost amusing. Almost. You're not poor, Mom. You just can't afford a lifestyle you never earned. There's a difference. I hung up and immediately blocked her number. Then I blocked Dad and Danny too. Whatever they needed to tell me, they could wait until I was settled in Hawaii. The flight to Honolulu was my first time on an airplane, and I spent most of it staring out the window in wonder. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, impossibly blue and peaceful. For 6 hours, I was suspended between the life I was leaving and the adventure ahead, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. The hospital in Hawaii was everything I'd hoped for and more. State-of-the-art equipment, collaborative team environment, and patients who appreciated the care they received. My supervisor, a nurse manager named Keiko, took me under her wing immediately. Mainland nurses always arrive looking shell-shocked, she told me during my orientation. Too much stress, not enough appreciation. Give it a month and you'll remember why you became a nurse in the first place. She was right. Working in an environment where my skills were valued and my well-being mattered was transformative. I remembered the satisfaction of helping people heal, the intellectual challenge of critical care nursing, the camaraderie of working with skilled professionals who respected each other. But the real revelation came during my first weekend off. I went to the beach alone, something I would have been too guilt-ridden to do back home, and spent the day reading a book I'd bought for pleasure, not obligation. As I watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd been this content. My phone had been buzzing with texts all day, but I'd left it in my beach bag, unopened. Whatever crisis my family was dealing with, they'd have to handle it themselves. What do you think will happen next? Can a family really change? Or is Maggie right to stay away? When I finally checked my messages that evening, I found 17 texts from various family members and relatives. The emergency this time involved Danny getting arrested for unpaid parking tickets he couldn't afford to pay off. Mom wanted me to wire bail money immediately. I read the messages while sipping a Mai Tai on my hotel balcony, then deleted them all without responding. For the first time in 3 years, someone else's crisis was not my emergency. Life in Hawaii settled into a routine that felt almost surreal after the chaos back home. I worked 4 days a week, leaving me with long weekends to explore the island. I hiked volcanic craters, learned to surf, and discovered a love of snorkeling among the coral reefs. Most importantly, I remembered what it felt like to live for myself instead of constantly managing other people's problems. The transformation wasn't just emotional, it was financial too. With the higher salary and no family expenses to cover, I was saving more money than I'd ever imagined possible. My savings account grew from hundreds to thousands, to an amount that made me giddy every time I checked the balance. But the biggest change was psychological. I stopped checking my phone obsessively, waiting for the next family crisis. I stopped calculating whether I could afford small pleasures. I stopped feeling guilty about every dollar I spent on myself. For the first time in years, I felt like a normal 30-year-old woman instead of a financial life raft for other adults. 2 months into my Hawaiian assignment, Keiko approached me with an unexpected proposition. "How would you feel about extending your contract?" she asked. "We've had a permanent position open up in our ICU, and your work here has been exceptional. The pay increase would be substantial, and we'd help you relocate permanently if you're interested." A permanent position in Hawaii. The opportunity I'd never dared to dream about was being handed to me on a silver platter. But first, I needed to know what I'd be returning to if I went back to the mainland. That night, I unblocked my family's numbers and prepared for the onslaught of messages that would flood my phone. I wasn't disappointed. 3 months of accumulated guilt trips, manipulation, and genuine family updates downloaded in rapid succession. The guilt trips were predictable. Your father is so depressed he can barely get out of bed. The manipulation was transparent. Danny had to drop out of school because we couldn't afford his expenses. But scattered among the emotional blackmail were updates that surprised me. Dad had been consistently working his security job and even picked up a weekend shift at a hardware store. Mom had enrolled in a community college program to become a medical assistant. Danny had indeed taken out student loans and gotten a second job delivering food on weekends. Most shocking of all was a text from Danny sent just a week earlier. I know you're probably not reading these, but I wanted you to know I graduated. I got a job offer from an accounting firm downtown. I start next month. I couldn't have done this without realizing I needed to stand on my own feet. Thank you for that. I read that message 3 times, hardly believing it was from my little brother who'd never held a job for longer than a summer. Maybe people really could change when forced to face the consequences of their actions. But change and forgiveness were 2 different things. I'd learned to trust my own judgment over the past few months, and my judgment told me that 1 semester of responsibility didn't undo 3 years of exploitation. The next morning, I called my family for the first time since leaving the mainland. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice breathless and hopeful. Maggie, oh honey, thank goodness. We've been so worried. When are you coming home? I'm not, I said simply. I've been offered a permanent position here, and I'm taking it. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. But what about us? She finally whispered. What about you? From what I've been reading, you're all doing just fine without me. That's not the point. You belong here, with your family. Do I? I asked. Because for 3 years, I felt more like an employee than a family member. When was the last time any of you asked how I was doing without following it up with a request for money? She couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. They'd never seen me as anything other than a solution to their problems. The conversation with Mom was painful but necessary. She cycled through all the familiar patterns: guilt, anger, bargaining, and finally, a kind of hollow acceptance that felt more like defeat than understanding. I don't understand what happened to you, she said, near the end of our call. You used to be such a caring person. I am caring, I replied. I'm just finally caring about myself, too. After hanging up, I called Danny directly. His number went to voicemail, so I left a message congratulating him on graduating and getting the job. 20 minutes later, he called back. I can't believe you actually called, he said, and I could hear genuine emotion in his voice. I heard about graduation. I'm proud of you. I almost didn't make it. After you left, I realized how much I'd been taking advantage. Not just the money stuff, but expecting you to handle everything while I just coasted along. We talked for an hour, longer than we'd spoken in years. He told me about his new job, his plans to move into his own apartment, his growing understanding of how much I'd sacrificed for the family. For the first time ever, my little brother sounded like a man. Are you happy there? He asked as our conversation wound down. I looked out my window at the palm trees swaying in the trade winds, thought about my fulfilling work and growing savings account, and the surf lesson I'd booked for the weekend. Happier than I've ever been. Good. You deserve that. It was such a simple statement, but hearing it from someone in my family meant everything. A week later, I received an unexpected package from home. Inside was a small photo album filled with pictures I'd never seen before. Danny at his graduation ceremony, Dad at his new job, Mom on her first day of classes. On the last page was a note in Danny's handwriting. Thought you might want to see proof that we're finally growing up. No pressure to come back, but wanted you to know we're learning to take care of ourselves. Also, Dad asked me to include this. Tucked behind the note was a check for $1,500 made out to me, signed by my father. The memo line read, "First installment on what we owe you." I stared at that check for a long time. It represented more than money. It was acknowledgement, responsibility, and maybe even respect. But it also created a problem I hadn't anticipated. If my family was genuinely changing, what did that mean for my decision to stay in Hawaii permanently? That evening, I called Sarah back home to get an outside perspective. They sent you money? She asked, incredulous. Your family actually sent you money instead of asking for it? $1,500. Danny says it's the first installment of what they owe me. Do you believe them? That they've actually changed? I considered the question carefully. I think they're trying to change. Whether that's permanent or just temporary desperation remains to be seen. So what are you going to do? I honestly don't know. But I was starting to realize that maybe I didn't have to decide between my family and my new life. Maybe for the first time ever, I could have both on my own terms. The answer came to me during a particularly challenging shift in the ICU. I was caring for a man who'd suffered a massive heart attack while visiting the islands with his adult children. As his family gathered around his bedside, I watched the dynamics between them, the gentle way they spoke to each other, the obvious love and respect, the way they shared both responsibility and support. This was what family was supposed to look like. Not one person carrying everyone else, but people choosing to care for each other as equals. That night, I made 2 important decisions. I would accept the permanent position in Hawaii, and I would give my family a chance to prove their changes were real. But this time, I'd be the one setting the terms. I called home the next evening with my decision. This time, I spoke to all of them on speakerphone, a family conference call that would have been impossible during their crisis-filled European adventure. "I'm staying in Hawaii," I announced without preamble. "I've accepted a permanent position here." The protests started immediately, but I cut them off. "However," I continued, "I'm willing to rebuild our relationship under certain conditions." "Conditions?" Mom's voice was sharp. "Yes, conditions. Because the old dynamic where I was your personal ATM is never happening again, regardless of where I live." I outlined my terms clearly. No more requests for money, ever. No more guilt trips about family obligations. No more expectations that I would drop everything to solve their problems. If they wanted me in their lives, it would be as their daughter and sister, not as their financial safety net. "And if we agree to these conditions," Dad asked quietly, "then maybe we can start over. Build something real instead of something based on my usefulness to you." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if they'd hung up on me. Finally, Danny spoke. "That sounds fair." "Fair?" Mom's voice rose. "She's abandoning her family and calling it fair?" "She's not abandoning us, Mom," Danny said with a firmness I'd never heard from him before. "She's setting boundaries. There's a difference." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Instead of me defending my choices while they attacked, we actually discussed what a healthy relationship might look like. Dad admitted he'd been hiding from his responsibilities by letting me handle everything. Mom struggled with the idea that her daughter might not always be available to solve her problems, but she didn't storm off the call. Most surprisingly, they agreed to family counseling via video calls, something I'd suggested but never expected them to accept. "We want you back in our lives," Dad said as the call ended. "If this is what it takes, we'll do it." 3 months later, our family looked completely different. Dad was working full-time and had started taking community college courses in his spare time. Mom had completed her medical assistant program and landed her first job in 25 years. Danny was thriving in his accounting position and had moved into his own apartment. But the biggest change was in how they treated me. Phone calls were no longer preceded by dread, because I knew they wouldn't end with requests for money. Instead, they were filled with updates about their lives, questions about mine, and slowly growing respect for the boundaries I'd established. The real test came when Dad called to tell me Mom's car had broken down, and the repair estimate was substantial. "I wanted to let you know what's happening," he said, "but not because we expect you to fix it. Mom's going to take the bus to work while we save up for the repairs. It'll take a few months, but we'll manage." It was the first time in 4 years that a family member had shared a problem with me without expecting me to solve it. The progress felt monumental, but the most meaningful change came during a video call with all of them where Mom said something that nearly brought me to tears. "I'm proud of you for standing up to us. I didn't like it at the time, but you were right. We were taking advantage, and you deserved better." Acknowledgement, accountability, respect. All the things I'd craved for years were finally being offered freely. 6 months after I'd moved to Hawaii permanently, I received another package from home. This time it contained a larger check, $5,000, along with a detailed breakdown of how much they'd calculated they owed me over the 3 years I'd supported them. The total was staggering, $67,000. "We know it'll take time to pay it all back," Dad wrote, "but we want you to know we understand the scope of what you did for us. This isn't charity or obligation, it's justice." I deposited the check but kept the letter. It was proof that people really could change when forced to face the consequences of their actions. A year into my permanent move to Hawaii, life had settled into something I'd never experienced before. Genuine contentment. My work at the hospital was fulfilling and respected. My social life included real friendships with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what I wanted and needed. My savings account had grown to an amount that would have seemed impossible during my years of supporting my family. For the first time in my adult life, I was considering major purchases for myself. A car that wasn't a decade old. Maybe even a small condo near the beach. But the real transformation was emotional. I no longer felt guilty about spending money on myself. I didn't apologize for taking time off work. I'd stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to other people. The relationship with my family continued to evolve slowly but steadily. Weekly video calls had become something I looked forward to rather than dreaded. They shared their successes and setbacks without expecting me to fix anything. I offered advice when asked and emotional support freely, but never again financial rescue. The progress culminated in an unexpected phone call from Danny, announcing he was getting married to his longtime girlfriend. Rebecca. We want to have the wedding here so you can come, he said, but only if you want to. No guilt trips if you'd rather stay in Hawaii. The invitation meant more to me than he probably realized. For the first time, my family was accommodating my needs instead of expecting me to accommodate theirs. I'd love to come, I said, and meant it. Planning for the trip home brought up complex emotions. Part of me was excited to see the changes in my family firsthand. Another part worried that being back in familiar surroundings might trigger old patterns. But I'd learned to trust my own strength over the past year. I was no longer the exhausted, overwhelmed woman who'd worked 16-hour days to fund other people's lives. I was confident in my ability to maintain the boundaries I'd established. The wedding trip was booked for a week in June. I arranged for a rental car and a hotel room, maintaining my independence even while visiting family. Sarah, who'd become my closest friend during all the family drama, offered to be my backup support system. "Text me if you need an emergency exit strategy," she said. "I'll call with a fake crisis if necessary." But as the trip approached, I found myself genuinely excited rather than anxious. My family had been sending monthly payments toward their debt to me without being asked. They'd maintained their jobs and their progress toward independence. Most importantly, they'd respected my boundaries for an entire year without a single guilt trip or manipulation attempt. Maybe it really was possible to go home again, as long as you were returning as the person you'd chosen to become rather than the person others expected you to be. The night before my flight, I stood on my balcony watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. A year and a half ago, I'd been a woman so beaten down by family expectations that I couldn't imagine life outside their constant demands. Now I was someone who'd learned to value herself enough to demand respect from others. Someone who'd discovered that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. Someone who'd proven that you could care about people without sacrificing yourself for them. Whatever happened during my trip home, I knew I'd be returning to Hawaii as someone who'd finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued. But first, I had a wedding to attend and a family to reconnect with on my own terms. The plane ticket in my hand represented more than just transportation. It was proof that some bridges, when properly rebuilt, could be stronger than the originals. The flight home felt completely different from my desperate escape 18 months earlier. Instead of running away from something, I was choosing to engage with it from a position of strength. The difference was everything. Danny met me at the airport, and the first thing I noticed was how much older he looked. Not just physically, but in the way he carried himself. This was a man who'd learned to take responsibility for his own life. "You look amazing," he said, giving me a hug that felt genuinely affectionate rather than obligatory. "Hawaii suits you." The drive to my hotel gave us time to catch up properly. He told me about his job, his relationship with Rebecca, his growing understanding of money management. But what impressed me most was what he didn't do. He didn't ask for anything. "I need to tell you something," he said as we pulled into the hotel parking lot. "Mom and Dad are nervous about seeing you. They're afraid you'll still be angry. Are they still the same people who spent my money on a European vacation while I worked myself into exhaustion?" "No," he said simply. "They're not." The reunion with my parents happened at dinner the next evening. I'd insisted on meeting at a restaurant, maintaining neutral territory for our first face-to-face encounter since the European disaster. They looked smaller somehow, less entitled and more human. Dad had aged visibly, but he seemed more present, more engaged than I remembered. Mom's appearance was the biggest change. She looked like someone who'd been working for a living rather than living off someone else's work. "You look wonderful," Mom said, and for once the compliment felt genuine rather than manipulative. The conversation was awkward at first, all of us dancing around the elephant in the room. Finally, Dad addressed it directly. "We owe you an apology that goes beyond money," he said. "We treated you like you existed to solve our problems, and that was wrong." "We've been going to counseling," Mom added, "learning about boundaries and healthy family relationships. It's been eye-opening." What followed was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. They acknowledged the specific ways they'd taken advantage of me. They explained the changes they'd made and why. Most importantly, they asked about my life in Hawaii without immediately following up with requests or complaints. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my parents rather than my dependents. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, but what struck me most was watching my family interact with each other. Dad walked Danny down the aisle since Rebecca's father had passed away, and the gesture felt natural rather than performative. Mom helped with last-minute details without creating drama or making herself the center of attention. During the reception, I found myself genuinely enjoying my family's company for the first time in years. We talked about my work in Hawaii, Danny's career plans, mom and dad's goals for their remaining years. Normal family conversations that didn't revolve around crisis management or financial rescue. But the real moment of truth came when Rebecca's wedding dress caught on something and tore slightly during the bouquet toss. Mom immediately sprang into action with a safety pin and some strategic adjustments, fixing the problem quickly and discreetly. "Thank you so much," Rebecca said. "I was panicking." "That's what family does," Mom replied. "We help each other." The phrase hit me unexpectedly hard. For the first time in my adult life, my mother had demonstrated helping someone without expecting payment or recognition. She'd simply seen a problem and solved it because it was the right thing to do. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Dad approached me with an envelope. "This isn't a wedding gift," he said. "It's the next payment toward what we owe you. We'll keep sending them monthly until we've paid back every dollar." Inside was a check for $3,000 and a letter detailing their repayment plan. They'd calculated interest on the original amount and committed to having everything paid off within 5 years. "You don't have to do this," I said, though I was touched by the gesture. "Yes, we do," he replied. "Taking responsibility means making things right, not just saying sorry." As I prepared to return to Hawaii the following week, I realized something profound had happened. My family had learned to function without me as their financial safety net. They'd developed their own coping mechanisms, their own solutions, their own sources of support. But more importantly, they'd learned to value me as a person rather than a resource. My last night in town, Danny and Rebecca took me out for coffee. As we sat talking about their honeymoon plans and my work in Hawaii, Rebecca said something that perfectly captured the transformation our family had undergone. "Danny talks about you all the time," she said, "about how proud he is of your independence and how much he's learned from watching you stand up for yourself. He says you taught him what self-respect looks like." Flying back to Hawaii, I carried with me something I'd never had before: a family relationship based on mutual respect rather than codependency. We'd all learned that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. 6 months later, I received the most meaningful gift of all: a photo from Danny and Rebecca's first apartment, which they'd furnished entirely with their own money. On the back, Danny had written, "Learning to stand on our own feet. Thank you for showing us how." Today, 2 years after canceling those credit cards in a Paris hotel, I'm planning my own dream vacation. Not to escape from my family, but to celebrate the life I've built for myself. A 2-week trip to New Zealand, paid for with money I've saved by finally putting myself first. My family will be fine while I'm gone. They've learned to handle their own emergencies, solve their own problems, and support each other without relying on my sacrifice. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe. And remember, teaching people how to treat you isn't cruel, it's necessary. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to enable their worst behavior. The woman who used to work 16-hour shifts to fund other people's dreams has finally learned to fund her own. And it turns out, when you stop being everyone else's solution, you become your own success story.